The first snow of winter had just begun to fall across the Wyoming frontier when Elias Carter, a quiet rancher who had lived alone for nearly 8 years, stopped outside the small railway station. He wasn't waiting for family. He wasn't expecting a friend. He was waiting for the woman he had agreed to marry through nothing more than a handful of letters. When the train doors opened, every conversation on the platform came to a halt. A graceful young woman stepped onto the platform, her elegance impossible to ignore. Elias stared in disbelief and whispered, "You're far too beautiful to be my wife." The young woman smiled gently, though a trace of sadness lingered in her eyes. "My name is Evelyn Harper," she said softly. "You must be Mr. Carter." Elias removed his hat, suddenly feeling awkward. "I think there has been a mistake." She glanced at the weathered photograph he held in his hand. "No mistake. You wrote every letter. And I answered every one." For the first time in years, the lonely rancher found himself speechless. Nothing in his quiet life had prepared him for this moment. The journey to the ranch took nearly 3 hours through snow-covered hills. Elias apologized more than once for the simple wagon, the worn blankets, and the modest cabin waiting at the end of the trail. "I can't offer you much," he admitted. Evelyn looked across the wide valley, where horses grazed beneath the fading evening sky. "I wasn't searching for luxury," she replied. "I was searching for peace." Those words settled into Elias's heart more deeply than he cared to admit. When they finally reached the ranch, Evelyn stepped inside the small wooden house. There were no expensive furnishings. No polished floors. Just a warm fireplace, handmade furniture, and shelves lined with well-worn books. She smiled. "It feels like a home." Elias blinked in surprise. Most people who visited his ranch saw only how little he owned. She was the first person who noticed what it could become. For the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt empty. The next morning, before sunrise, Elias quietly saddled his horse to begin another long day's work. As he reached the barn, he stopped in disbelief. Evelyn was already there. She had rolled up her sleeves, gathered fresh feed, and was gently calming an injured foal. "You should be resting," Elias said. She looked up with a warm smile. "I didn't come here to be taken care of. I came here to build a life, with you." Standing in the morning light, Elias felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Over the following weeks, the ranch slowly began to change. Empty flower boxes outside the cabin filled with color, fresh bread replaced canned meals, and laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence. Yet one thing puzzled Elias. Every Friday afternoon, Evelyn walked alone to the old hill overlooking the valley. She stayed there for nearly an hour before quietly returning home. She never spoke about it. Elias wanted to ask, but something in her eyes told him she would share the truth when she was ready. One evening, a wealthy cattle baron named Nathan Holloway arrived at the ranch in a polished carriage. His expensive coat stood in sharp contrast to the dust-covered boots of the ranch hands. Looking at Evelyn, he smiled with quiet confidence. "You don't belong here," he said. "You were meant for a life of grand homes, elegant parties, and servants." Elias lowered his eyes, believing the stranger's words might be true. But before he could speak, Evelyn stepped beside him and gently slipped her hand into his. She looked directly at Nathan. "When I lived among wealthy people," she said calmly, "everyone admired what I wore." She glanced at Elias with a soft smile. "But he is the first person who ever cared how I feel." Nathan's smile slowly disappeared. Without another word, he climbed back into his carriage and rode away. Watching the wagon disappear into the distance, Elias realized something he had never understood before. Love isn't measured by comfort. It's measured by kindness. That Friday, Elias quietly followed Evelyn to the hill. Hidden behind an old pine tree, he watched her kneel beside a simple wooden cross. Tears filled her eyes as she placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the ground. "I kept my promise, Mama," she whispered. "I found a man with an honest heart." Elias stepped back silently. He finally understood. She hadn't come to the hill because she missed her old life. She came to thank the mother who had taught her what truly mattered. That evening, Elias apologized for doubting himself. "I kept thinking," he admitted, "that one day you'd realize you deserved someone better." Evelyn smiled, took both of his hands, and looked into his eyes. "I didn't marry the richest man. I married the right man." For the first time since they had met, Elias no longer saw himself through the eyes of his fears. He saw himself through hers. And in that quiet moment, their marriage truly began. Spring arrived, melting the last patches of snow that had covered the valley for months. With the warmer weather came longer days, and Elias worked from sunrise until dusk repairing fences damaged by the harsh winter. One afternoon, he returned home expecting another quiet evening, but instead found dozens of neighbors gathered outside the cabin. Fresh paint covered the porch, new windows reflected the golden sunset, and smiling ranchers tipped their hats. "You helped every one of us," an old neighbor said. "Now it's our turn to help you." As the celebration continued, an elegant woman stepped out of a carriage and introduced herself as Margaret Whitmore, Evelyn's aunt. She had searched for her niece for months after learning of her marriage. Looking around the humble ranch, she sighed. "Evelyn, come home with me. Your grandfather's estate is yours now. You'll never have to struggle again." The crowd fell silent. Even Elias lowered his eyes. He couldn't blame her if she chose a life filled with comfort instead of hardship. Evelyn walked slowly toward the carriage, leaving everyone speechless. She looked at the polished leather seats, the expensive luggage, and the servants waiting respectfully nearby. Then she turned back toward the little ranch where Elias stood quietly beside the weathered barn. She smiled, walked past the carriage without hesitation, and took Elias's rough hands in her own. "My home isn't where the money is," she said softly. "My home is wherever this man is." Margaret looked at the couple for a long moment before opening a small wooden box. Inside lay an old wedding ring that had belonged to Evelyn's grandmother. "My father always believed wealth was measured in land," Margaret said quietly. "My mother believed it was measured in love." She placed the ring in Evelyn's hand. "Today, I finally understand she was right." Even Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she embraced her niece before returning to the carriage. That evening, Elias and Evelyn stood together on the porch, watching the stars appear above the Wyoming mountains. Elias gently held the family ring. "I still don't understand why you chose me," he admitted. Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder. "Because you never tried to impress me," she whispered. "You simply showed me who you are." For the first time in many years, Elias stopped questioning whether he was enough. He finally believed he was exactly where he was meant to be. A month later, dark clouds gathered over the valley, and a violent spring storm swept across the frontier. The river overflowed, fences collapsed, and frightened horses broke free from their pens. Ranchers from miles away rushed to save their livestock, but the raging water cut off the only bridge leading to the valley. Without hesitation, Elias saddled his horse and rode into the storm. Before he left, Evelyn quietly slipped his old leather gloves into his hands. "Come home safely," she whispered. Elias smiled. "I always will." By sunrise, the storm had finally passed. Exhausted but determined, Elias returned with dozens of frightened families, children, and their animals who had been stranded on the far side of the river. The people of the valley welcomed them with warm blankets, hot food, and grateful tears. Watching from the porch, Evelyn realized something that no amount of money could ever buy. The lonely rancher who once believed he had nothing to offer had become the man everyone trusted when hope seemed lost. A few days later, the townspeople gathered outside the church for the annual spring festival. The mayor stepped forward and handed Elias a small carved wooden plaque. "This isn't for being the strongest rancher," he said. "It's for reminding all of us what real character looks like." The crowd applauded, but Elias only looked toward Evelyn. She smiled with quiet pride, knowing the greatest reward wasn't the applause, it was seeing the man she loved finally believe in himself. That evening, Elias confessed something he had never shared with anyone. "When I wrote those letters asking for a wife," he said softly, "I wasn't looking for romance. I was simply tired of eating alone, working alone, and growing old without anyone to share life with." Evelyn gently squeezed his hand. "And I answered because I wasn't looking for a perfect man," she replied. "I was looking for an honest heart." The silence between them said more than words ever could. 1 year later, the Carter Ranch looked nothing like it once had. Wildflowers surrounded the cabin, healthy horses filled the pastures, and children's laughter echoed across the hills as neighbors gathered for a harvest celebration. Standing on the same porch where he had once doubted himself, Elias looked at Evelyn and smiled. "I was wrong the day we met," he said. "I thought you were far too beautiful for me." Evelyn laughed, slipped her hand into his, and answered, "No, Elias, we were simply meant to find each other." As the sun dipped behind the Wyoming mountains, the lonely rancher realized the greatest blessing of his life had never been the ranch he built, it was the family they had built together. The frontier stretched endlessly before them, but neither of them would ever face it alone again.